I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington. In Venezuela, allies of President Nicolas Maduro now control all institutions of the country's government. Maduro installed a new National Assembly filled with his supporters in early January. That came after legislative elections that the main opposition parties boycotted. The United States and other countries still recognize opposition leader Juan Guaidó, who had headed the assembly, as Venezuela's legitimate interim president. Vanessa Neumann formerly represented the Guaidó government as its ambassador to the United Kingdom. She joins us from New York. Thanks for joining us today, Vanessa.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure, Gene.
How would you describe the current state of the opposition right now in Venezuela?
Well, complicated and weakened. I mean, I do support the fact that, the mission of the interim government that was recognized in early 2019 was to get Venezuela to free and fair elections. That has not happened. There are no conditions for free and fair elections, and therefore the basis for that existence and that administrative continuity, as they call it, is there. However, so that's the moral and the constitutional mandate in that dimension. However, from a more realpolitik standard, the continued international support, of which the number one ally has, of course, been the United States, followed closely by the United Kingdom, who both recognize Juan Guaidó explicitly as the interim president of Venezuela, which is very important, especially, I was dealing with issues to do with the Bank of England, et cetera, and those issues continue. But in realpolitik terms, there are a number of other countries that have started a little bit backpedaling in their recognition and in their work. And I saw that even while I was in London. Even for staunch allies like Brazil, and even, Ecuador and even Latin American countries have started to go a little bit backwards in the recognition of Guaidó for a number of reasons, including the fact that I think there are two things on both sides. One is Maduro has taken very good advice from Putin, who has said, continue engaging diplomatically. Don't burn your bridges, start trying to make friends again, stop fighting with everybody and increase your diplomatic engagement, keep that open. And on the other hand, and aside from the influence operations assisted by the Russians, but on the other hand, you do have the inescapable fact that we're entering year 3 of Guaidó's mandate. And Maduro is not only still there, but is actually stronger than before because time favors Maduro. And so people go back and they have to start to wonder that even though they back democracy, they're on the side of the Venezuelan people. Is Guaidó the man for the job? Do you have a strategy? And what's your plan? And because that hasn't happened, people say, well, why am I going to be burning my diplomatic and my political capital on a guy who's very nice, has the moral mandate, and we support that, but are you going to get the job done that we gave you the backing for? So I think it's very complicated.
Right. Now, there's a few things that you brought up there I'd like to dig into a little bit deeper if I could. Now, when you're talking about international recognition of the Guaidó government, of course, the United States still recognizes Guaidó as Venezuela's president. But as you know, recently, the European Union dropped that recognition. Now, when talking about the EU specifically, what does that move by the EU mean for Guaidó and the opposition in Venezuela?
That's a great question, and I think it really warrants some clarification. The EU per se never recognized Guaidó as interim president. You could never get all the countries to agree and issue a joint declaration. So what has happened and what we were working with, I and my other, diplomatic envoys, fellow diplomatic envoys in Europe, we had specific countries that recognized Guaidó as interim president. And those are the countries to which I and my colleagues were appointed. But the EU as a unit never did, because you had Greece and you had Italy and Slovakia and a couple of other countries, right, that never came on board. What happened, so the counter argument from the Guaidó team is, well, nothing's changed there. The reality is, again, the realpolitik is more brutal, because I knew, even while I was still in London, that the individual countries were starting to backpedal. So what has happened is, in reality, they have taken cover under the EU that never really, acknowledged Juan Guaidó as a unit. And now they individually, the countries, are not issuing the statements of recognition that I had in my time before, or we had when I served. So they have backpedaled, and they're sort of using Borrell to sort of take cover because it became too diplomatically painful for them. And that's a terrible thing to say, because we still need the fight for democracy in Venezuela. But that's the reality. It's complicated.
With that sort of lack of recognition, though, what does that really do to the Guaido government with that sort of backpedaling? Does it make it more difficult for him? Does it make it more difficult for the opposition in order to try to get rid of Maduro?
Yeah, of course it makes it more difficult. It makes it more difficult because it translates into very real things like asset recovery, ability to get support, whether it's humanitarian aid support or some form of security support moving forward for the Guaido team. What is going to happen is that they are being forced to, or they will be forced to enter into some sort of a negotiation. However, we've been negotiating with Maduro to get out for, I don't know, since 2013 or something, or 2014, and asking for a referendum, and that hasn't happened. So they will, and I think what they're going to be forced to do as well is to take on board a broader coalition, that it can't just be the so-called G4 parties and their political operators, which is very complicated. And when I was representing in the UK, it was a huge source of frustration for me and many of the other diplomats that the politicking at home in Caracas operated as sort of a parallel universe to what we were doing internationally. So I think that it does make things significantly more complicated, and it means that the negotiated strategy and the multilateral strategy will have to take place, and that, of course, means that it's going to take a while.
And what do you think the international community should do right now in terms of Venezuela and in terms of the opposition? Certainly a new government in the United States. And so what do you think the Biden administration and other countries around the world should do with regard to Venezuela at this moment?
Well, I think that there's a lot of really good things that you could do. So one of the things that, I had developed, and frankly, one of the reasons I resigned, was I had helped develop a massive plan with a 46-page white paper and, slide presentation of what to do to fight the illicit financial flows coming out of Venezuela, do a comprehensive asset recovery program, how you build the arguments, how you build the political will, what's the judicial framework, how do you set it up, put it into a basket that's a fund that's untouchable except by a legitimate government and with international oversight of an international standard, and becomes the embryo of a future sovereign wealth fund. We had it from soup to nuts. It was approved and worked on with the British government, and then it was just let drop by the interim administration of Guaido, and then we read about the scandals in the Washington Post. So if that had been handled properly, and that is something that the Biden administration can get behind, a multilateral work and things that are specifically of counter-kleptocracy in anti-corruption. Venezuela's collapse is caused, and the human rights abuses are deeply tied to the corruption and the kleptocracy. Even the UN Human Rights Commission report said that the human rights abuses and the torture and the EJKs, the extrajudicial killings, are carried out in furtherance of the kleptocracy and the corruption. So that really needs to be tackled. And bringing back those integrity protocols and working with the OECD, with FATF, with the European Union, UNCAC, UN anti-corruption protocols, UNODC, UNICRI, which is another UN organization that does capacity building of judiciaries and judicial frameworks, should be working on the Venezuela issue. And what you should do is seize that money, freeze it, and use that as part of the negotiation. and also use that as a seedling and put all that money in a giant basket. I first proposed this in 2017, and here we are 4 years later, and it has not yet been properly enacted by anyone. And it really needs to be enacted. And I really think that that's a core issue, because it is the core of how Maduro operates as a criminal enterprise, and it's a source of the problems. And if you want to negotiate, great, but you also need a stick. And I do think that the financial aspect is the stick. And that's not a sanction. That's completely different. And you can look at it as tackling illegality. Kleptocracy, money laundering is illegal, period. So you don't have to get into the political aspects of right versus left, or, you know, US led or not US led. You can leave that all aside and get on board with tackling this sort of criminality.
Right. Finally, I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned your resignation as Guaido's envoy to Britain. Of course, that happened just before Venezuela's legislative elections in December. So could you tell me and elaborate on that a little bit more with regard to why you stepped down from that position, and whether you think Guaido is an effective leader for the opposition?
Oof. I think Guaido is very brave. I had the pleasure of meeting him. Ironically, I'll tell you quickly the story. I actually first met him in person. I had spoken with him, but I never actually met him when I got appointed. And when I actually met him in person was when he arrived in London, and for the meeting with the Prime Minister, when we had our first meeting in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I walked in and I burst into tears, and I said, my president is here. We've done it. It's a sense of, we beat the dictatorship to get him out and get him here, and that he represents the hope of Venezuela, and he's very brave. I do think, however, it is time to reconsider. I think we do need a very muscular and independent leadership, independent that is not bound by the sort of parceling out of the political cake that is so insistent of the G4, who are always perennially handing out, swapping favors before you're even in power. And I found that very frustrating. You need to just designate an A team, put together a team that is really a parallel government ready to go, like a shadow government. Here's your defense minister. Here's your minister of the interior. Here's your attorney general. You elect us, you bring us into power. This is what you get. These are our positions. And those people are dedicated to arguing one for one against all the nonsense that comes out of the Maduro dictatorship. And then so that people know what they're getting, and so does the international community. So I think that we do need someone who's also more charismatic with the international media. Venezuela is a terrible tragedy. I mean, frankly, everybody the president talks to should be in a flood of tears about what's happening in Venezuela. And I think it is time to consider new strategies and leadership.
That's all the time that we have for today. Vanessa Neumann, former Juan Guaidó appointed ambassador to the United Kingdom, joining us from New York. Thanks again for your time today.
Thank you.
I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington.